So the way this is going to go, I'm just going to start by introducing you a bit, and you can add any information you want to this if you would like to. And then we can go straight up to the questions.
Sure.
Also, just to introduce myself very fast, my name is Rasha. I'm currently responsible for the YouTube channel of the International Association for Political Science Students, and we do weekly videos with discussions with different professors from all around the world. So thank you so much for being one of them. To introduce you, you teach political science at the University of Alberta, and you're also Associate Chair for the Department of Political Science. You describe yourself as a...
No, so that was last year.
That was
Yeah.
last year. This
So
is
no,
what
I'm
I
a
found on your
professor.
profile.
Yeah, no, I'm a professor of political science, and I was previously associate chair graduate, but that's not my
That's
responsibility.
not...
Yeah,
Okay, I'm so sorry about that.
that's okay. Yeah.
Thought I informed myself correctly, but
No,
apparently...
there's lots of bios floating out there, and things change all the time. Yeah.
Okay, so you're currently a professor of political science at the University of Alberta, and you describe yourself as a academic. So this means that you're a practicing political scientist and you're now working in the academic field. In fact, you were director of learning and development policy, senior operations manager, and director of intergovernmental relations. Now your work focuses on intersection of political culture, political parties, and public policy. By political culture, we mean norms and values. You also focus on provincial politics, so Canada elections policy, on elections and electioneering, comparative public policy, and political acumen/equity. So to start with my first question, how do you expect Canadian political culture to evolve and affect next provincial elections? And do you think it's affected by way or another by the population's modern relationship with social media?
Yeah. So political culture is by its nature fairly stable, right? If you can think of political culture as climate, public opinion is like the weather. So we use surveys all the time to figure out how Canadians or Canadians living in certain provinces feel about the issues of the day. The political culture are the underlying norms or values that inform the politics. So it's much longer term, but it's also embedded in a way that sometimes people don't appreciate for themselves, right? So part of our research here under the Common Ground Initiative is to try to tease out the differences between who Canadians actually are through surveys in terms of their attitudes and who they are demographically as well, on one hand, from who they think they are as a political community, right? What they think are the communal norms that govern politics in Canada and different parts of Canada. And sometimes those things don't always line up. So here in Alberta, for example, when we have our focus group activities, we ask our participants to do a very simple thing, and your viewers can even do this right now too. We ask them to draw us an Albertan. And using that technique of personification, we found that the vast majority of people will draw somebody, you may have drawn this in your mind, somebody who's like a cowboy, right? Or somebody who works in oil and gas. They're usually middle-aged, white, blue-collar men, right? And by unpacking why it is that that's the first image that pops into people's minds, we start to get a feel for what it means to be Albertan, what it means to be accepted in that mainstream culture. And a lot of folks are not drawing themselves, and we don't see a lot of diversity in those drawings. But by going a little step further, what we find is that by using that persona, usually the most common name that's associated, we ask the participants to name the drawing, they say Joe. So Joe Albertan, right? By understanding how Joe Albertan feels about politics, we start to unpack what are some of the guideposts or the principles or values that undergird that political community. So we know that Joe is typically more conservative than what we see in terms of the average survey respondent here in Alberta. So there's a gap there between who Albertans think they are as evidence to that political culture focus group drawing activity and who they actually are, as we find through surveys. Now, your question as to whether social media in particular influences these kinds of culture shifts, first of all, they're very, very rare. You can probably count on one hand the number of times in the last 100 years that political cultures across Canada have changed. The more pronounced ones probably the Quiet Revolution in Quebec in the 1960s, and perhaps Quebec's undergoing another revolution right now as they swing back to a more conservative form of politics. But it's tough to tell when you're in the midst of a culture change, right? And what are the contributing factors? What we suspect is that once populations start to become aware of how different they are as people from who they think they are, once anomalies start to pop up, and once old ways of thinking fail to solve new problems, that's when we start to see these political cultures prime for some kind of a shift. Social media can certainly play a role in that, in helping to connect people with other folks who they realize are just like them, who may help them to realize that, you know what, that perception that we all seem to have about who we are is not real, because I'm talking with all of these other people that don't think or act that way. That can spark culture change, and we saw that in the form of the Arab Spring as well. So a lot of different things going on, but that's what we're focusing on through our Common Ground research out here at the U of A.
Okay, so we shouldn't worry about social media for its disinformation and misinformation, for example.
Well, I think that's another question entirely. First of all, disinformation and misinformation have been around long before social media. It's just that it didn't travel as widely or as quickly. It used to be through pamphlets and backroom secret societies and so on. It was every bit as pernicious, but it wasn't as fast moving, and in that sense, not as difficult to. It was not as difficult, I think, to tamp down. The other thing too is that with the proliferation of media outlets now, which is in many ways good, we have a lot more voices that are out there talking about news, but there is no one authoritative voice, right? As Canadians used to have when they had two national news channels and a handful of national newspapers. Now there are many sources, legitimate or not, that are proclaiming to have the truth, and that makes social media, I think, a little bit more difficult to handle when it comes to disinformation.
Yeah, more difficult, but also more democratic. So there is really both sides to it. So to come back to the political culture question, what we could say is that its evolution is so slow that we can't really notice it on the spot, and would only notice it once it's done or years after.
There's different types of culture change. So there's the sudden breaks, right, that happen over a period of months or years. But even when we look at that, it's tough when you're in the middle of it to figure out, are we shifting, or is the system going to revert back to what we call normalcy or equilibrium? So it's tough to tell when you're in it. But I think that search for sudden dramatic changes is embedded in our own human nature. We think if something big happens, it must have a big cause, when sometimes cultures may shift over very long periods of time, and we may have to look more further into the past to find the antecedents or the catalysts that were involved in sparking that culture change. And unfortunately, as political scientists, one of our challenges is that we don't have the baseline data available to figure out, it looks like things are different now, but we don't have the evidence of what it was before, right? So there's all kinds of challenges in studying culture change, but it's one of the mysteries of political science that our team just loves to tackle.
Very interesting. And according to your ongoing research project, the Consortium on Electoral Democracy, would you say there is an issue of underrepresentation in elections, and how is it affecting the country's democracy?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So the CDEM project is a national one that we've been studying provincial elections and federal elections over the last 4 or 5 years, and definitely representation is one element that we're studying through that. But it really depends on how you conceptualize the concept of representation. right? So Hannah Pitkin wrote a famous piece where she talks about the different types of representation being symbolic and and descriptive representation. I think a lot of people, when they think our institutions aren't representative, they look to descriptive representation. In other words, do the people that are populating our institutions, like parliament or legislatures or the courts, do the people that have positions of power there look like the people that they're supposed to be representing? So we look for factors like gender, ethnicity. In more recent times, we've started turning our attention importantly to issues of ableism, language, sexual orientation, and a whole bunch of other categories that were not even on the radar 10 or 15 years ago. And in most cases, yes, traditionally marginalized groups are underrepresented in a lot of those institutions, but not always, right? So some of our appointed institutions like the Senate or the Governor General or the Supreme Court have seen major gains in recent years because there's been a focus on ensuring that those institutions look like the population. In some cases, we found that some groups are actually overrepresented compared to their share of the population. That's not a bad thing, especially when you consider these institutions historically. But some other people don't look at descriptive representation as being, the be all and end all of what we should aim for in our institutions. They may say that just because somebody looks like me or looks like people in my community, however you define that, doesn't mean that they're standing up for our interests, right? So other folks rely more on substantive representation. In other words, I don't just want somebody to go there and sit for me and look like me. I want somebody to stand up for my interests. And sometimes that may mean that they don't have to look like me. There may be some people that represent my community's interests, but they don't have to be from my community, right? In other times, it's the reverse. So I think we have to kind of hang a question mark on how representative our institutions are in terms of asking, well, what kind of representation do each of us expect out of these different institutions?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. And do you agree with this last approach you were talking about? Like, what would you say about it? Because I'm assuming at the end, some people would need to be represented by people like them because they would go through the same experiences. Would you say it's something essential or not really when it comes to elections and politics?
I think lived experience is very important. And I think that we should have our institutions try to balance between descriptive and substantive representation. Mm-hmm. There are important role modeling effects, for example. By seeing more women in provincial legislatures, we know that has an effect on more women wanting to run for office because they see it as a possibility, and more wanting to get involved in politics more generally, for example. The real challenge here is trying to balance between having descriptive representation and substantive representation. And in Canada, we're very fortunate that we have so many different institutions that we can we may not find ourselves attached in a descriptive or a substantive way to our provincial representative, for example, but our federal representative does look and talk and think like us. So in that way, having so many democratic institutions is a benefit to Canadians.
Okay, thank you. And what particular changes have you noticed throughout the years when it comes to the evolution of elections in Canada? It could be about political engagement, public opinion, the trust in the government, or any other factor.
Yeah, I don't know if I would so much say that there's been change as much as stability. Okay. Right? A lot of what we know about why people engage in politics, why they vote for the parties that they do, a lot of the theories that we came up with 50 years ago still hold up pretty well when we run the same models today to figure out the importance of, how your parents voted has a huge impact on how you vote. That's been the case throughout the last 50 years. It's not just how your parents vote, but if your parents vote. We know that there's a strong familial effect. We also know that where you live also plays a major role in how you look at politics, whether you live in a rural area or a city, and so on. So to me, I wouldn't say it's so much the changes, but the stability in what we know about how and why people engage in politics that fascinates me.
Okay, and I'm assuming it must be a good thing in Canada, the stability.
Yeah, I mean, there's that. There's our understanding of why people behave the way they do, and then there's democratic stability in general. I think we are seeing some worrying signs in terms of the rise of groups of folks that feel so disconnected from politics that they're not turning to conventional institutions to represent them. Right, so I'm kind of dancing around modern right-wing populism here, but at different times throughout Canadian history, there are different groups that are objectively, marginalized, and folks that feel like they're marginalized or alienated. More recently, this group of people who feel like they're falling behind tend to be the groups that were dominant, 10 or 20 years ago. So these are folks that work primarily in primary resource sectors, agriculture, natural resources, and that kind of thing. They tend to be white, tend to be male, tend to be blue collar jobs, and so on. And those folks have in recent years come to see themselves as falling behind their own expectations of where they thought they would be. They see their lives and livelihoods being worse off than their parents. And they look at other groups in society who seem to have made gains over the last number of decades and generations, and they think that those folks are getting ahead, so it must mean that I'm falling behind. And this feeling for them is a reality. Economists and others will point to the fact that they're not worse off than anybody else. In fact, they're still better off by having the privileges that they do in our society. But that feeling doesn't go away. In fact, it's only intensified when people start to lecture them about how you shouldn't feel that way. And I think one of the greatest challenges facing politicians, particularly here in Western Canada, honestly here in Alberta right now, is to figure out a way to prevent that ingrained sense of status loss from bubbling into extremist behavior. And we saw this in the form of the Coutts border blockade, which was an extremist arm of the Freedom Convoy, and other worrying trends like separatism. So when we talk about stability, I want to make it clear what we know, how we know people interact with politics hasn't changed, I don't think, as much as you'd expect it to over the last 50 years. But politics itself has become more unstable, particularly here in
I can't hear you anymore. I don't know if you can hear me.
Hello?
The image just stopped. Yes, can you hear me?
Okay, yeah, we're back.
Yes.
Do you need me to go back on any of that, or are you okay?
No, I think I'm good with this question. Okay. Thank you. Okay. My next question is based on the Common Ground research project you're leading. How is the presence of progressives and conservatives affecting political culture in Canada right now? Oh, I think it's doing the same thing again.
Sorry, I'm trying to figure out whether it's my connection or yours.
Yeah, me too. I'm not sure. I'm sorry about that.
Maybe... It's okay. I can switch to data right now. Is that okay? Do you want me to do
that? Yes, sure. If you're comfortable doing this.
Yeah.
Sure.
Hold on.
We'll discover.
Yeah. Hold on. We'll check here. So I'm fully on data right now, and it seems to still be freezing. So I'm not sure.
Okay. It might be.
Keep going if you want.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. If the problem is still here, we can just remove the image at some point. It's fine. Yep. So my next question is based on your Common Ground research project, and was, how is the presence of progressives and conservatives affecting political culture in Canada right now?
Yeah, I think that there's a sense among many people that the political culture in Canada is becoming more polarized, right? There's a sense that there's clearly a left and a right in Canada, and those are represented federally by the Conservative Party on the right and the Liberals and New Democrats on the left, with different dynamics happening in Quebec with different parties involved. But there's generally a sense that Canada's become more polarized. But that's the general sense. That's not what we're actually seeing when we do surveys, for example. The vast majority of Canadians place themselves in the center of the political spectrum. In other words, they want to see themselves as centrist. They don't view themselves as being on a pole or diametrically opposed to other people. Right?
Okay. I'm actually surprised by this answer. Yes.
Yeah, and we only start to see the polarization when we start when we group people into these partisan groups, right? And then we start to see some separation between New Democrats and Conservatives, for example, out here in Alberta. But the modal Albertan, the average Albertan, like the average Canadian, doesn't want to see that, doesn't place themselves there. They actually see themselves as quite middling and moderate.
Okay. I'm surprised because I really believed that there was more polarization, and I was gonna actually tell you that I thought that social media was leading to a certain level of polarization. So that's very interesting results. And do you think they're what do you think they're saying about these people?
Yeah, I think, well, social media creates the sense that of othering and strong in-group affinity and out-group animosity. As we study this, we call it affective polarization. Certainly there's a sense of that. But again, I come back to the difference between who we think we are and who we actually are.
Yeah.
So there's a set of theories out there called social reality theory or false sense of social consciousness, which suggests that people have a very different idea of who the average person is compared to who they actually are, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in the United States, for example, there's been recent research that shows that when you ask people, how worried are you about climate change? The average person is quite worried, right? More people than not are worried about climate change. When you ask them, what do you think the average American feels about climate change? They're likely to say, oh, I don't think they care that all that much, right? So and because people don't feel like everyone else shares their views, they're less likely to promote those views. They look at themselves as being outsiders and, okay, well, I mean, I may be concerned, but my concern doesn't really matter because nobody else is. But there's a false sense of social reality there. So in a way, getting back to this issue of polarization, if we all think the system is polarized, then it very well may become a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Where, okay, well, I think it's polarized. That means I've got to choose a team. But if you take a look at individual survey results, you'll find that people don't have that tendency. They don't want to be on the extreme left or the extreme right. Where they get pulled into this is through the mechanism of identity, right? When you ask them to pick a side and you ask them, are you a New Democrat or a conservative? Or you ask them, are you a progressive or a conservative? Then they'll team up. That's kind of embedded in human nature as well. And that's when you'll start to see those strong in-group and out-group dynamics. But according to their attitudes, people are not actually all that polarized in Canada.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So in the end, your perception of yourself and your political actions are going to depend on your surroundings and your social circle, broader or the smaller one.
Yeah, I think that the Canadian political scientists have done a very poor job, honestly, of studying the impact of contextual factors on people's vote choice. So to get at this in political science language, we need to do more ecological analysis. In other words, looking at the impact of where somebody is situated on how their behavior turns out. So instead of asking questions like, why do certain people turn out to vote while other people don't? Interesting question. It's a good one. We should continue asking it. But we should also ask, why do certain constituencies, why do certain provinces have higher levels of turnout versus lower levels of turnout? Because sometimes, the dynamics within those communities are what's driving. It's not the individuals within them. It's the situations they find themselves in. So we've done some research in the past that found that certain provinces feature higher levels of turnout because their party systems are more competitive, right? Or they have a higher number of people that were born and raised in that community, and that creates a sense of attachment and civic obligation that we don't find in other places. So as a political science community, I think that's an area of research that we could do more on. What are the contextual factors that impact people's behaviors?
Mm-hmm. I do think it's essential too. Like in anything else, the context is probably like 70% of everything that's happening, the event or the action. I have a final question for you, which is, do you think that current policies are representative of the collective will and political culture in Canada?
It depends on the policy, but I'll give you a little bit of a story to reinforce my point here. I think a lot of people, when they think about policymakers, and they usually turn to politicians and ministers and the prime minister and premiers in Canada, they do have a lot of power. So let's look at their decision-making structure. They're impacted when they make these decisions, not just by evidence. If you're a good public servant or policy analyst, you give them all of the evidence as to why this policy would be better than others. They're influenced by a whole pile of other non-evidence-based factors, including political culture. So here's my story. During the early waves of the pandemic out here in Alberta, the health minister was holding a town hall in a small community, and somebody in the audience stood up and asked a question. Minister, why don't we have a province-wide mask mandate? Why don't we require Albertans throughout the province to wear masks when they're indoors? Because clearly the science shows that it contains the spread, and other jurisdictions that have done this have shown that they were able to control the spread of COVID-19. And the health minister's response to that question, it just shows you how powerful the grip of political culture is on politicians. His response was, "That's all fine. I've seen the evidence as much as you have, but how am I supposed to sell that policy to the guy in Cold Lake?" Now, Cold Lake is a small community in Alberta, but his mind went to, how am I supposed to sell this idea, this new policy, to the guy in Cold Lake? The guy in Cold Lake is effectively the Joe Albertan, right? The average Joe that comes to mind for that politician when they're crafting policy. So Joe, the guy from Cold Lake, is kind of the barometer for what's acceptable, what's desirable, what's possible in that minister's mind when it comes to public health policy. So it doesn't matter what kind of evidence you put in front of him. If he's in that mindset, he's already thinking about what the possible is. So in his mind, that's who the average Albertan is. As I've discussed, that's not what public opinion showed us. That the vast majority of Albertans wanted a mask mandate as he was making that comment. But for him, that wasn't who he thought the average Albertan was. So political culture has this powerful effect, not just on individuals who may think about, well, how would Joe Albertan react to a PST? Or provincial sales tax. Oh, he won't go for that. So I can't possibly stick my neck out because I'll be seen as being extreme. Or if a political party advocates for a provincial sales tax, they're radical. There's no way they have a chance of winning. It also impacts politicians, right? And what they see as feasible and normal. So that's what our research in Common Ground is trying to do, is unpack this relationship between public policy, political culture, and public opinion.
Yeah, well, because we usually tend to think, like a lot of people usually tend to think that it's always politicians who mold the public opinion, but I do think it's also, and mainly the opposite, like it's the public opinion that's gonna define the actions of leaders, political leaders.
It's really interesting to think about when those ideas are out of sync, though, right? Mm-hmm. So the provincial government here in Alberta has come under quite a bit of criticism for having a very outdated view of what Alberta is, right? You know, their view of who the average Albertan is really quite drawn from the 1990s, right? And former Premier Kenney was fond of using Ralph Klein's language when he would refer to Martha and Henry, who were seen as being the extremely normal Albertans. Well, Martha and Henry, if you think of those, you can probably picture who you think Martha and Henry are. They're really old first. They're white. And they probably, worked on the farm or something like this, when the vast majority of Albertans don't look like that or do those things. So the governments can get themselves into a lot of trouble when they have an outdated view of what the political culture is.
Okay. Thank you so much. This was a very, very interesting discussion. And I think I am done with my questions. I don't know if you have anything to add to what we already talked about.
No, just happy to be here.
Well, thank you so much. I was really happy to have this discussion with you. Thank you again for being here. And I will send you the link as soon as the video is uploaded on our YouTube channel. Okay. Thank you.
Great, sounds good.
Have a good day. Bye-bye.
You too.